We're talking about marriage in the home, but especially we're looking at marriage right now. We've covered a lot of other subjects. This is lesson 13. We're talking about the husband and wife team at the moment. It's teamwork that's involved. Young people, a lot of times, they don't understand what married life is going to be like. You have your perception of what it's going to be like, and then when you get married, it's a whole lot different than what you thought. It's all not sugar and spice and everything nice. Sometimes it's challenging, but it always requires a great deal of teamwork. I want to talk today about the marriage vow. This is the promise that we made when we got married, most likely. The vow is a promise, but most importantly, it's a commitment. And this is where I think we're lacking so many times today, is so many people do not take their commitments seriously. And you have to. When you get married, you make a commitment to God and to your spouse. And it's a commitment that's till death do we part. And we're expected to keep that commitment. It'll be hard. Be real hard sometimes, but we made a commitment, and we're required to keep that commitment. Is that me popping? You can't hear anything, can you? You can hear a word I'm saying, can you?
Yeah.
Can you? Okay. But a commitment is very important. When we tell somebody we're going to do something, we ought to do it. And that's what I'd like to talk about a little bit today. In the marriage vow, some of the things we promise. Do you agree to live according to God's ordinance pertaining to marriage? If you get married by a preacher, most likely that's one of the things you will be asked. If you get married by a JP or something like that, they probably won't ask you that question. But most preachers will ask, do you promise to live according to God's ordinance as it relates to marriage? Because marriage is a divine ordinance. In Genesis 2:18, the Lord God said, "It is not good for man to be alone. I will make him a helper." The marital arrangement was made by God. He's the one that established it. He's the one that knew it was a necessary thing for most people. And he is the one that regulates it. There's no set way to perform a marriage ceremony. There's no certain words you have to say. Basically what happens is most preachers, using various Bible principles, will develop their own vow, unless the people want to make their own vow. But it'll go something like that. Do you promise to live according to God's ordinance? Will you follow God's rules as they pertain to marriage? And there are rules. Sometimes we wish we had a rule book to live by. Well, we've got one. The Bible tells me how to behave as a husband and a father, and it tells my wife how to behave as a wife and a mother. And when we make a promise, when we get married to God and our spouse, that's most often one of the promises we make. Now the question is, will we live up to our commitment? Will we live by the commitment we made to God and to our spouse? Will we live according to God's ordinance, the chief purpose being to get my wife to heaven? That's the number one role, the number one purpose of marriage. Alone, we are not complete. Together, we are complete. She completes me, I complete her. And my responsibility, my primary responsibility, is to get her to heaven. Am I going to keep that commitment? Am I going to make that my primary goal, my primary aim in life? Will that come first, above and beyond all other things? Well, that's what I promised to do when I got married. Am I still living by that commitment 30-something years later? 7, this November. 37 years later. This November. Am I still keeping that promise? Will you forsake all others? Probably for most people, the closest relationship we have is the relationship with our parents before marriage. In Genesis 2:24, the Lord said, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother. He must resolve, he must commit himself to leaving his mother and his father. These days, that doesn't happen very often. One of the reasons, and I think psychology got it right, is that people are too immature who get married. They haven't been weaned yet. Things are a lot different now than they used to be. There was a time when 13-year-old boys and girls were mature enough to marry, back probably 100 years ago. The way they lived, the way they were taught, a lot of people got married at the tender age of 13, what we call tender, but they were capable of living that way. And then the numbers rose as time went by. We thought about 18-year-old was a good age to get married. The last time I checked, which was probably 5 to 10 years ago, the ripe age for marriage was 26 years old. Now, what they mean by that is most people are not mature enough to enter the state of matrimony until they reach the age of 26. And I'm fairly confident that number's probably a year or two higher right now. And this happens a lot of times. A boy, a girl gets married, and they do not turn loose of mama and daddy. And that creates a problem. The new wife doesn't want to hear how mama cooked biscuits. And she don't want to be told that, I guess if I ever want chocolate gravy on my biscuits again, I'll have to go back to mama's. And the husband doesn't want to hear how great daddy is and all the things daddy can do, all the things he has purchased along the way. Sometimes youngsters do not turn loose of mama and daddy, and because of that it creates problems. Well, that's the first thing God said. You got to leave mom and daddy. You got to cut the Gordian knot. You got to step out on your own 2 feet. But too many children aren't ready to do that. They're not grown up enough to stand on their own 2 feet. They got to have mom and daddy to tell them what to do. That's a failure of parenthood too, I might add. My responsibility as a father was to train my children to stand on their own 2 feet as adults, to function. If I died, they can keep on keeping on and never miss a lick. It was my responsibility to make them mature enough that when they reached adulthood, they could survive on their own 2 feet. But today, that doesn't happen a lot of times. Children are coddled. They don't know how to work. They don't know how to assume responsibility around the house. If someone doesn't tell them what to do, they don't know what to do. And then here you got this 20-year-old boy who goes and gets married to a woman, and he doesn't know how to do anything unless somebody tells him to do it. And the wife doesn't want to have to babysit her husband. She wants a man. So sometimes there's a problem there. A big problem too. I deal with marital problems a lot. That's part of what I do. And this is an issue. Most of the time it's with boys that can't turn loose of mama. And the new wife is not happy. She's not happy. She's got her own family. God said, leave your father and mother. That way you can be joined to your wife and you two can become one. If a man doesn't leave his father and mother, he cannot be joined to his wife. They will not become one flesh, and you got a problem, a big problem. You got to leave your mother and father. You got to get on with your own family. And if you don't do that, there will be issues, and it won't be pretty. It won't be pretty. Do you agree to take this person? As a man, am I man enough to assume responsibility of this person? Is she woman enough to take me and assume responsibility for me? Are we willing to do that? take the responsibility of another human life. And it's something, it's very monumental when you think about that kind of responsibility. Responsibility for another soul. Are you willing to do this? Are you willing to take this person to have and to hold as your own, to have as your possession, to hold onto in a variety of ways? Or do you agree to take this person for better or worse? And there is better and worse. Sometimes situations change. Think over our lives, those of us who are older, all the changes we've seen in our lives. Remember when the interest rates skyrocketed back in the 70s? Remember when we had those great long gas lines? Remember when so many people lost their homes, lost their farms, lost their equipment? Sometimes circumstances change. Things happen sometimes beyond our control. Times change. Sometimes people change. You know, none of us, we're not static. We're very fluid. All of us change with time. Hopefully, we become better people. That's the goal, is to become a better person as we age. But sometimes that's not what happens. Sometimes people become, I'll use the word worse, because they change in a manner that's detrimental to a relationship rather than positive. Circumstances change. People change. Now, when you get married, you're making a promise, you're making a commitment that you're going to hold on to this person if times change, and you're going to hold on to this person as you and your spouse change. My wife didn't marry a preacher, for example. And if she had known I would be a preacher, she might have run for the woods. But she had no idea she was marrying a preacher. Well, what do you do when your husband becomes a preacher? A lot of people, they're gone. They're out of there. Who wants to be married to a preacher? They're stuffed shirts. They're not fun people. Many women wouldn't handle that change very well. What you commit to when you get married is that you are going to stay with that person through better and worse times. You stay with them through richer or poorer. We know how that goes. Sickness and health. I knew a couple, I didn't know them personally. Let me take that back. I got an article one time, and this story was in it. There were Christians, I think in the state of Louisiana. This boy and girl, well, they were a man and woman. They were 20-something. They got married, and they had a reception, and then, of course, after that, they left to go on their honeymoon. Well, as they were driving the car on the interstate, there was a terrible traffic accident, and it turned out that the man who was driving the car, he wound up being paralyzed from his neck down. And the rest of his life, he was going to be spending that way. He was paralyzed from his neck down. He couldn't do anything. He had no motor skills at all. I think he did do something with a stick in his mouth, maybe control a wheelchair or something. But these people got married, and they made a promise to one another that they would be faithful through sickness and health. Now, granted, this is a worst-case scenario. This couple never came together, not even one time. And their world was turned completely upside down. What would the wife do? That wife is still living with that man. And this happened some 20, 25 years ago, best I recall. But she's still living with him, and he's actually writing articles that appear in journals. They've continued in the state of matrimony. How sad, how sad, how sad. But we make a promise, sickness and health. What do you do if your spouse is crippled in such a way that you have to change their diaper? Will you keep your promise? Sobering thought. It's a sobering thought. Their mother and father would have done that. You know that? Their mother and father would have done that. If you'd have left that child at home and that happened to her, her parents would have taken care of her. But now she's married to you. Are you going to do that? Or would it have been better off if she'd never met you in the first place? Think about it. It's sobering, isn't it? It's a frightening thought. We pray God it never happens, but it could. It's one of the promises we make, to love, to honor, and to cherish. As we live, things change. Times change. We meet different people. We meet interesting people. Sometimes we talk about there's only one person in the world for me. Well, as you live, what you're going to discover is that there's more than one person that is compatible to you. There are other people who are also compatible. You'll meet these people, you'll work with them, you'll get to know them, and it's really quite possible that you could develop some type of a feeling for that individual. Here's the question: what are you going to do about it? Are you going to sit on those feelings? Are you going to squash those feelings? Or are you going to allow those feelings to develop? This happens a lot. And nobody wants to talk about it. Who would? But sometimes situations get so bad, people will talk to me about it. And I know it happens. And I know it happens a lot. And one or the other has to learn how to deal with the situation. It could be dealt with, but you got to be willing to deal with it. What do? You promise to love, honor, and cherish. Will you say no to those urges? Will you say no to those temptations, those desires? Or will you let the natural order take its course? Don't be too quick to speak. It can be harder than we think sometimes. We make a promise, we make a commitment, and we make it to God, to our spouse, and to our family, and to all people. Will we honor our commitment until death we part? That's what most of us promised to do when we got married. It's good to be reminded of that sometimes, what I promised to do. Made a covenant with God. That's a contractual agreement. We didn't sign on a dotted line, but we made a contractual agreement with God and with our spouse. And that's the covenant that God holds us amenable to. But this is basically what we promised to do. It's a mouthful, but it's also something that we must do. Till death do you part. Paul touched on that in Romans chapter 7, verses 1 through 3. Do you not know, brothers, I am speaking to those who do know the law, what the law teaches, that the law is binding on a person only as long as that person lives. Well, that makes sense. The laws of Tennessee are binding on me, but if I die, they're not binding anymore. They can't come and take taxes from me anymore. The federal government, the IRS, they can't collect taxes. I'm dead. I'm gone. The law is only binding as long as I'm alive. And that's what Paul is saying. For a married woman is bound by God's law to her husband while he lives. But if her husband were to die, well, obviously she's released from the law of marriage. God releases her from that law. Accordingly, she will be called an adulteress if she lives with another man while her husband lives or is alive. But if her husband dies, she is free from that law, and if she marries another man, she is not an adulteress. The words are too easy to misunderstand. The reason I put that up there is to emphasize the fact that when we make a vow to God and our spouse, we are promising to keep our commitment until one of us dies, until the law is no longer amenable. This is the will of God in regard to this matter of marriage. And it's not hard to understand. It's hard to accept, but not to understand. In the book of Malachi, he's writing about the period 457, 432 BC. The Jews were spiritually dead at this time, or lukewarm. They weren't interested in religion. They weren't spiritual at all. They were going through the motions of some things, but they weren't really serving God from the heart. And they were perplexed. They prayed to God. They asked God for help. They were persecuted by outsiders. Sometimes a man may not have money, or there may be sickness. He prayed for a son or daughter to be made well. Whatever the case might be, they were praying to God for some kind of assistance, but they got no assistance. God would not answer their prayers. No matter how often they prayed, no matter how hard they prayed to God, God would not answer their prayers. And they didn't understand why he wouldn't answer their prayers. And this is what Malachi is talking about. Their worst flaw of all was their disregard for the marriage covenant. I want you to think about that. Out of all the things the Jews were doing during that particular period in time, the thing that upset Jehovah God the most was that they were not honoring their covenants in marriage. They had resolved to do like we resolved to do, but they didn't keep their commitments. They broke their commitment. They broke their promise. And he was upset, and he would not listen to them. They prayed, and he would not listen to them. There were several things wrong, but this was the icing on the cake, according to Malachi. In chapter 2, verses 14 through 16, here's what we read. Because the Lord was witness between you and the wife of your youth, to whom you have become faithless. You have not been faithful to the wife of your youth, whom you made a contract with, even though she is your companion and your wife by covenant. You took her as your wife, as your companion through life, and you made a covenant with me, and you made a covenant with her, that you would be faithful until death. And in spite of that, you broke that covenant. You haven't been treating her right. You've been treating her badly. The New King James Version uses the word treacherously. You've been treating her treacherously. It wasn't just a matter of divorce. It was a matter of not treating their wives with dignity. And Jehovah was angry with them, and he wouldn't listen to their prayers. Did not God make them one with a portion of the Spirit in their union? Isn't that what marriage was? The husband, the wife, and the Spirit of God living with them. And what was the one God seeking? What was he looking for in this union? Godly offspring. Had you kept your covenant to me and to your spouse, you would produce godly offspring in most circumstances. But you didn't do that. That's what I wanted. That's why I arranged the marriage covenant. If you kept it, this would have been the results, the consequences. But you didn't keep it, therefore you're not bearing godly offspring. So guard yourselves in your spirit. Let none of you be faithless or treacherous to the wife of your youth. Marriage is a three-way covenant, and this is what we have to understand. We promise to love, honor, cherish our wife. Well, what are we doing 20 years later? Are we loving, honoring, and cherishing our wife? Are we treating her like a servant? What are we doing with this person we made all those promises to and to God? We made a commitment when we got married. The three-way marriage is between God, the groom, and the wife. According to J.G. Baldwin in his commentary on Malachi, he said the loyalty of each partner to the covenant of God is a uniting bond which creates a lasting championship between the partners. Notice the key words. Loyalty to the covenant of God is a uniting bond that creates a lasting companionship between those two. loyalty. He's talking about commitment. Commitment is the key to a successful marriage. That's the key. We make promises. We make a covenant, which is a contractual agreement between us, our spouse, and God. We promise to do certain things. And if we keep our commitment, we'll live the most successful life that people can live in this world. But if we do not, if we break our promise, if we start treating our spouse treacherously rather than faithfully, we're going to experience the wrath of God in our lives. And not just the wrath of God, we're going to experience the judgment of God. Marriage is one of the most important institutions, I believe, God ever devised, with the exception, of course, of the Church of Jesus Christ. But marriage is right there at the top of the list because that's the foundation on which society rests. I should analyze myself as a husband. Am I still keeping my commitment to my wife? Or have I broken it? Am I still treating her like I promised I would? I told her daddy I would. Have I lied to him by treating her less than I said I would? These are things to think about, to examine ourselves with, and to make sure we're living as God wants us to live. If you're not a Christian, the purpose of life is to become one. That's the reason for our being. To become a Christian, to obey the gospel of Jesus Christ, to be an heir of salvation and eternal life, we are to believe that Jesus died for the sins of the world. Stop sinning, which means stop violating God's will for our lives. And to be immersed in water. The moment in time when Jehovah takes away sin. Colossians chapter 2 and verse 12. As Christians, we have an obligation. We are to keep the covenants we establish along life's way. We are to keep our promises. How are we doing in the area of our marriage? Husband and wives. Wives can be brutal sometimes also. Are we treating one another the way we ought to be treating one another? It's going to have a direct effect on our children. It's going to have a direct effect on our own person and character. And it shall have a direct effect on our standing in the day of the judgment. So how are we doing? If you have problems you need to resolve, we can get together and talk about it. There's resolutions to everything. Just got to talk about it. But if you need God's forgiveness today, I hope you'll come while we stand and while we sing.